Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here today. We've heard a lot about the regulatory burden on our smaller banks. And look, I get it. There are certain rules that are either too broad or too burdensome, given the risks that smaller banks pose. And that's why I have joined with all of my Democratic colleagues on the Banking Committee to introduce a bill that would provide targeted relief to small lenders without rolling back the rules on big banks that pose a real threat to our financial system. But I do want to take a closer look at the idea that Dodd-Frank has dramatically increased costs for small banks and undermined their financial performance. So let's start with the costs part of this. Dodd-Frank changed the law on how FDIC calculated what banks owe in deposit insurance assessments. The Dodd-Frank change allowed community banks to pay far less in assessments, while bigger banks would pay far more. The Independent Community Bankers of America, the main lobbying group for community banks, said at the time of Dodd-Frank that the change would save community banks collectively about $4.5 billion in just a 3-year period. Now, Mr. Porch, do you know how much your bank has saved on FDIC assessments because of this change in Dodd-Frank?
I do not know the answer to that question, ma'am. Thank you.
Okay, maybe you could get back to me later on that?
I certainly would.
Okay, Mr. Foster, do you know how much your bank saved?
If I could answer that maybe in a little bit different way. When I joined the bank 20 years ago, up until the late 90s, we were only paying the FICO assessment, which to our bank...
I appreciate that, Mr. Foster, that there was a big change. What I'm asking is that Dodd-Frank, when it was passed in 2010, changed the way FDIC assessments are calculated. The estimate was that over a 3-year period, it would save community banks about $4.5 billion, and I wondered how much your bank saved.
I can give you the exact number. We have saved from that point forward.
Okay.
But I could submit that.
I would appreciate having that. And just for the sake of comparison, I think you said, Mr. Porch, that your bank spent $222,000 in total regulatory costs last year. That's all in, that's everything. The regulations you did before Dodd-Frank, after Dodd-Frank, everything. Is that right?
That is correct, but be mindful that of that $222,000, that doesn't include any salaries.
No, I understand.
Okay.
That this is what you identified in your testimony, because I'm trying to do the math on this, because according to the ICBA, the average community bank saves about $250,000 every year because of the change in FDIC assessments. Now, I know that savings will vary depending on the size of the bank, but the point is Dodd-Frank included a trade-off. It imposed new rules to protect consumers and our markets, necessary rules to stop the kind of behavior that led to the last crisis. And then, to reduce the financial burden on community banks, it also significantly reduced the cost of insurance that those banks had to pay. To get the full picture of Dodd-Frank's impact, it's necessary to add both the regulatory costs and the regulatory savings. And that brings me to the issue of financial performance, which, since I'm running low on time, I'll just try to hit this as quickly as I can. Ultimately, financial performance seems like a pretty good measure of the health of our community banks. And according to the latest quarterly report from the FDIC, year-over-year earnings for community banks in the first quarter of this year were up over 16%, which was 3 times the growth of larger banks in that same time period. Only 5.8% of community banks were not profitable in this quarter. That is the lowest level since the second quarter of 2005, long before Dodd-Frank was passed. You know, community banks play a critical role in Massachusetts, all across this country, and Congress should look for ways to get rid of unnecessary rules for smaller banks and for credit unions. But as we consider legislation, we need to move past the idea that Dodd-Frank has crushed community banks. It is just not true. No matter how many times lobbyists say it in hearings or in the media or in our offices. When I look at the data, I see two big things. According to the banking lobby itself, Dodd-Frank was projected to save community banks billions of dollars in FDIC fees, and 5 years after the adoption of Dodd-Frank, the community banks collectively had their best quarter in a decade, and their profitability is increasing 3 times faster than the profitability of big banks. This committee should legislate based on the facts, not on a make-believe narrative that is pushed by lobbyists looking for sweeping changes to our financial rules, changes that would mostly help the big banks. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.